Okay, so we're going to be practicing different watercolor techniques. So our first one is a wash, and this is a large flat area of color. So I'm going to just get my orange a little bit darker. Take my large flat brush and fill it with paint, and come over here to my wash area and just very carefully pull my paintbrush across that box. Should not be any scrubbing or crazy directions with a wash, because our goal is just to have one flat area. And with watercolor, we also need to just be very patient. So I'm going to let that settle and then come back and look at it and see if I need to make any adjustments to it. But horizontal stripes, even flat color. Now, your next two boxes are layered washes, and we're going to start with just a regular wash on top and then come back to it after it dries. So I'm going to put a light blue on here, and this is just good practice for creating nice flat washes. And then use this yellow green that I have over here. So for boxes 1 through 3, you're just going to start with regular washes in them, and then 2 and 3 we will come back to later. It's not quite dark enough, it's not going to work for what I want later. Okay, we'll go green. Alright, so looking back at my orange, it started to kind of pool and create a darker line here at the top. So what you can do, if that happens to you, is take a little corner of your paper towel and just absorb it very gently, like that, and now it's all in the corner. I'm going to dot on top of there, and then let it resettle, and it should be relatively flat. My blue's looking the best, and my green also looks pretty good. It's just that orange. Okay, so that's how you create a wash. We will come back to 2 and 3 later. Now, wet on wet, you may have accidentally discovered with these two boxes here if you accidentally touched colors, but one of the good and bad things about watercolor is if you have two colors painted on your page and they touch, they will bleed together, which can be really cool, but it can also be really frustrating if you want hard edges. So watercolor bleeds together, it is watery, it's something that we can use to our advantage. So for this box, just put two colors next to each other and see what happens when they bleed together. And then for box number 5, we're actually going to start with clear water, just from our water cup, on our page in a wash. And then I'm going to take one of my smaller paintbrushes and drop some color on top. And this is just very mesmerizing, and it kind of spreads like tie-dye, and play around with kind of the different effects of watercolor bleeding and blending together. You can also take clear water and kind of mix things together like I'm doing here. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow just for fun over here. But experiment with putting different colors on top of that clear wash in your wet on wet box for number 5. Okay, box number 6 is gradation. So for this, we've done gradations before, and we know that they're a fade from dark to light. So I'm going to take blue straight from the pigment and paint a stripe of it at the top of my box. And then I'm going to rinse out my paintbrush so I have just clear water. And I'm going to very quickly, I may have had too much water in my brush. We'll see what happens. Paint one more stripe below it, and it'll slowly start to pull the pigment down. Yes, that was too much water. I'm going to dry off my paintbrush and grab more clear water and paint another stripe right below it. I'll go over that a couple of times just to help my watercolor pull itself down. Now at this point, it's a little bit uneven, so I'm going to take a just barely damp paintbrush and kind of help it along a little bit. We do have to be patient with watercolor. Sometimes it wants to do its own thing and we want it to do our thing. So don't overwork it. That's looking better. I can also take some more blue, pop it on the top, and do that process a second time with less water. That's looking better. I'm going to give that a minute to settle while I move on to gradation number 7. So this is, we're going to do 2 colors together. So I would do probably 2 neighboring colors, just so that way we don't get any kind of browns in the middle of our gradation. So I'm going to do blue and green for mine. So I'm going to paint some blue here. Get some clear water and pull it towards the middle. And then I'm going to get some green and do the same thing in the opposite direction. And I want for this to fade from blue to green. I'm going to go backwards a little bit into the green, but I will give it some time to settle. This one's looking a lot better. A nice fade from dark to light. This corner over here is a little bit darker, but that's okay. And as this settles, I think it'll start to look a little bit more flat. Alright, technique number 8 is dry brush. Now, this is named badly. I don't know who named it. Dry brush is when you paint on a dry area. Obviously, because we're using watercolor, we cannot have a dry brush, but any dry brushing that you do should just be on a dry piece of paper. So this is for small details and textures. So just practice creating different lines, textures, and shapes with one of your smaller paintbrushes. So this is my small round paintbrush. I could also use a flat one for this, but dry brush does not work on a wet area. So like if that was still wet and I wanted to dry brush on top of it, it would go like that because that's technically wet on wet. So dry brush must be done on a dry piece of paper. It could be an area that's already painted or a plain white area, but again, has to be done on a dry area. Okay, our next 3 techniques are about saving kind of the white of our paper. So again, with watercolor, we have no white, we only have water and the white of our paper to create lighter values or white. So one of the techniques that we can use to save an area as we're painting is masking, and this is just with masking tape. So you can use masking to tape off an edge that you want to be nice and clean and straight, because we know that sometimes watercolor is hard to control. So you can put a piece of masking tape there. You can also take your masking tape and maybe cut it or tear it into smaller shapes and stick it on your paper. And then paint over it. So here I'm doing this on white paper, so my area under the tape will stay white. But if I masked over this blue wash here and I painted over it, everything under the tape would just be light blue. So you can save colors, you can protect edges, you can save the white of your paper. So I'm going to paint a wash over that, and then I need to wait for it to dry, so probably the next day I can peel off that tape. So that's 9, masking. 10 is negative. So negative painting is another way to save the white of our paper, and this is very easy. It's just painting the negative space. So if I wanted to have a white triangle, I would paint around the white triangle. It's negative space. I could also let this dry and do more negative painting in the other areas like I have here on my other sheet. So I have this white triangle. I let that dry and I painted around a second triangle and this one. I could do it for a third time and paint all the way around all these triangles. And again, watercolor is transparent and it's really nice because we can build up slow values through different layers. There's a hair on my paper. So after this dries, will have 3 different values of triangles because I've done 3 different negative painting layers. Ta-da! Okay, technique 11 is resist. So this is another, it's more of a drawing technique if we're being honest, but another way to keep kind of white areas on your paper. So using a white crayon, you can draw lines. Oh, I just snapped it. Oh well. Lines, shapes, textures. It is very hard to see, like it looks like I'm doing nothing right now, but when you put a wash over it, the white crayon will repel your watercolor and your design will reveal. I don't think I pressed hard enough over here because it's not showing through quite as much, but this is a crayon resist. Okay, 12 is sponge. So this is, excuse me, a texture technique. So we have little sponges for watercolor, and you just mix up a color. It does not really work if you use it here just because our sponges are kind of messy. Mix up a color, fill your sponge with it. You don't want it to be too drippy, so maybe squeeze it out a little bit. And then press texture onto your box. Now what you don't want to do is sponge so much that there's no texture, so leave negative space in your sponging. And then with sponging we can also build up a lot of layers of value. So let me do a swap. Here I did a blue. I need a darker color. Whoops. Oh my goodness. Okay, I can grab some more green and sponge on top of that to create a darker value on top of my lighter value texture. So you can build a lot of really cool, interesting layers with sponge. And then box 13 is supposed to be splatter. That says negative, but we are splattering for this box. So splattering can be pretty messy, but I'm going to show you 2 techniques to do it well. So first technique, you're going to grab your flat brush and dip it into, actually I want kind of a watery wash for this. So I'm going to get more of a watery watercolor. And then what you're going to do is take your brush and pull your finger from one side of the bristles to the other, but we're going to do that pointing down at our paper and very carefully. So this creates more of a small splatter texture. I did get some kind of big drips out of it. You may notice that it went into some of your other boxes, and that is fine. Splatter is kind of hard to control, but doing it with this technique and then the next one can help control where it does go. So next technique, we need our small round brush. Fill it with watercolor so it's kind of drippy. You're going to point it down towards your paper, and then take your other finger and you're just going to tap on top of your paintbrush. And this creates bigger splatters. So those are our two splattering techniques. Move this up a little bit, maybe. Move this down. We'll do that. Alright, so our last box down here is Graffito, and this is more of a drawing technique, just like Resist. And we are starting this one with a watercolor wash, because it has to be done while it is wet. So, watercolor wash, and then you're going to take the end of your paintbrush and scratch into your paper. I don't really know what happened there, but this is more what it should look like. I think there may have been some paint on the end of my paintbrush. So what this will do is it dents your paper, and the watercolor will pool inside of it. Yeah, there's paint on the end of my paintbrush. Oh well. The watercolor will pool inside of it, and it'll get a step darker. So if you are not confident in dry brush, or maybe you don't want to resist and have things be white, you can use Graffito as a way to add textures or lines. Alright, before we get to our last two, I like to call them freestyle boxes, we're going to go back up here to our layered washes. So, thinking about watercolor and the properties of it that make it different and unique, when we put down a wash and we let it dry, we can paint on top of it with the same color to make it darker. Again, watercolor is transparent, so we'll be able to see this layer and that layer together will kind of make it darker. If I were to put orange on top of my blue, because watercolor is transparent, my orange is going to look a little bit brown, because we know that blue and orange are complementary colors, and when they mix together, they turn brown. So, be careful what colors you are layering on top of each other, because complements will make each other brown. Now, if I take blue and put it on top of my green, it should look more like a blue-green. So we always have to be thinking about color theory with our layering. So those are our layered washes. One last thing about layered washes. Oops, sorry about that. You cannot put a lighter color over a darker color. So if I were to take some of my, actually I think I want yellow, like a really light yellow, and try and put it over my green that I have here, it barely shows up, because yellow is a really light valued color and green is darker. So we have to work from light to dark with our watercolor. Alright, I'm going to move this carefully. There we go. Your last two boxes are your practice boxes. They are for you to try maybe one of these techniques again. Maybe you combine techniques, masking with a gradation, or sponging with splatter. You're just going to kind of experiment with your different watercolor techniques in these two practice boxes here.